Racist cop shoots black little girl for no reason. Unaware her father is a powerful judge. I have the dream of reaching 3,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Subscribe, leave your life, and be part of this dream too. Thank you. The sun shone brightly over the city park. Its rays danced on the leaves of the oak trees and cast intricate patterns on the sidewalks. Scarlet Carter, an energetic 8-year-old with skin the color of rich ebony, ran ahead of her father, Judge Christian Carter, holding a vibrant yellow kite. The park was their weekend sanctuary, a place to escape the weight of Christian's high-stakes career in the courtroom. Scarlet's laughter echoed across the field, drawing smiles from other park-goers. Christian watched her with a mixture of pride and joy, marveling at her ability to bring light to any room or open space she entered. Today was supposed to be just another day of peace, far removed from the struggles and tensions of the world. As Scarlet played, Christian took a moment to sit on a nearby bench, engrossed in a novel. His well-tailored suit, though casual by his standards, spoke of his prominence. But here, in the park, he was just Scarlet's dad, a man dedicated to cherishing his daughter. He barely noticed when a police cruiser pulled up on the street bordering the park, its engine humming low like a distant threat. Officer Matthew Harris stepped out, his eyes scanning the crowd with a gaze hardened by years on the force. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying an air of authority, Matthew's demeanor often intimidated those he encountered. His biases, honed through years of unchecked power, influenced how he perceived the world, a fact hidden beneath the veneer of his uniform. Matthew's attention settled on Scarlet, who was now chasing her kite with abandon. To him, her exuberance looked like recklessness, her presence an anomaly he couldn't reconcile with his narrow worldview. Misreading the scene entirely, he mistook Scarlet's sudden darting movements as a sign of danger. His hand instinctively rested on his holster, a dark thought forming in his mind. The air grew tense, though no one else seemed to notice. He approached cautiously, each step echoing his internalized fears and misconceptions. Christian glanced up from his book just as Matthew reached the edge of the field. The officer's posture immediately set him on edge. A lifetime of navigating racial prejudice attuned him to moments like this. He rose quickly, calling out to Scarlet, but his voice was lost in the hum of the park. Matthew, now fully focused on the child, made a decision that would alter all their lives in an instant. He drew his weapon, his voice sharp and commanding, and fired a single shot that shattered not only the tranquility of the park, but the very foundation of his own life. The sound of the gunshot reverberated across the park, silencing the carefree laughter of children and the murmur of conversations. Scarlet fell to the ground, clutching her leg as a searing pain engulfed her small frame. Her kite, now forgotten, drifted downward, its vibrant yellow a stark contrast to the dark stains spreading on her jeans. The crowd froze in collective disbelief, unable to process what had just happened. Christian, propelled by a surge of adrenaline and terror, sprinted toward his daughter, his voice breaking as he shouted her name. Matthew Harris stood rooted, his hand still gripping his gun, his mind racing to justify the unjustifiable. In the span of a heartbeat, he went from an officer responding to a perceived threat to a man standing in the shadow of his own recklessness. His assumptions, formed through years of prejudice, collided with the reality before him. The realization hit him too late. The threat was an innocent child whose only crime was playing freely in a public park. Yet Matthew's training failed to guide him now. Instead of rushing to assist, he hardened his expression, masking his inner turmoil with a facade of authority. Christian reached Scarlet, dropping to his knees as he assessed her injury. The sight of her small body trembling in pain ignited a fury he had long kept buried. "Help!" he yelled to no one in particular, his commanding voice reverberating with urgency and rage. Other park-goers began to react, some dialing emergency services, while others rushed toward the scene. The once idyllic park now resembled a battlefield, with Christian cradling his injured daughter at its center. Scarlet whimpered through tears, her tiny hand gripping her father's with a strength that belied her fragile appearance. As sirens wailed in the distance, Matthew attempted to regain control of the situation, his voice gruff. "Back away. This is a police matter," he barked, though the command lacked conviction. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, filled with accusations and disbelief. "You shot a child!" one voice cried out, echoing the collective outrage. Christian, rising slowly, his face a storm of grief and fury, locked eyes with Matthew. "Do you even realize what you've done?" he thundered, his tone cutting through the chaos like a blade. Matthew faltered, unable to answer. In that moment, he saw not just a grieving father, but a man who exuded an authority far greater than his own. A man whose power, both personal and professional, would soon come to bear. The park swarmed with flashing lights as ambulances and police vehicles arrived. Paramedics rushed to Scarlet, who clung to her father with tear-streaked cheeks. Christian's jaw tightened as he watched them work, their hands swift, yet gentle. The sight of her pain fueled his growing determination. He could not allow this injustice to fade into obscurity. The crowd that had gathered around bore witness, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. Many recorded the scene on their phones, capturing every detail. Matthew Harris standing stiffly by his cruiser, his face pale but expression unreadable, and Christian's unyielding presence beside his daughter. Matthew attempted to assert himself, barking orders at the bystanders to disperse. "Move along, let the professionals do their job," he snapped. But his voice lacked its usual authority. No one moved. Instead, murmurs of indignation rippled through the crowd. A woman stepped forward, her phone raised. "How dare you talk to us after what you did? You shot a little girl." Her words hit like a thunderclap, igniting a wave of condemnation. The officer's face reddened as he struggled to maintain control, but the truth was laid bare before all. His badge could no longer shield him from accountability. Christian knelt beside Scarlet as the paramedics prepared to transport her. He placed a steady hand on her cheek, his voice soft and soothing despite the storm brewing inside him. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart," he whispered. Scarlet, though trembling, nodded weakly. Her resilience only deepened his resolve. He turned to one of the paramedics, his tone sharp. "I'll be riding with her." There was no room for negotiation, and the paramedic simply nodded. As Christian climbed into the ambulance, his gaze briefly landed on Matthew. No words were exchanged, but the intensity in Christian's eyes spoke volumes, a silent vow that this atrocity would not go unanswered. As the ambulance sped away, leaving the chaotic scene behind, Matthew was approached by his commanding officer, who had arrived moments earlier. Captain Richards, a veteran of the force, wasted no time pulling him aside. "What the hell happened here, Harris?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with fury. Matthew hesitated, fumbling over his words. She looked suspicious. I thought..." The captain cut him off with a glare that could pierce steel. "You shot an unarmed child, Harris. Do you understand what you've done?" Matthew's silence was damning. Richard surveyed the scene, noting the crowd's anger and the cameras still rolling. He knew this incident was far from over. It was just the beginning of a storm that would engulf them all. The sterile hospital corridors echoed with hurried footsteps as Christian paced outside the operating room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He replayed the events in the park over and over, each memory sharpening his anger and resolve. Scarlet's cries still rang in his ears, a haunting reminder of the pain inflicted on his innocent daughter. As a judge, Christian had witnessed countless injustices, but nothing prepared him for this, a direct assault on his family. He stopped abruptly, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. Losing control wouldn't help Scarlet now. He needed to channel his emotions into action. Hours passed before the surgeon finally emerged. Christian approached, his expression an intense mix of desperation and determination. "How is she?" he demanded. The surgeon offered a weary but reassuring smile. "She's stable. The bullet missed any major arteries, but the damage will take time to heal. She'll need physical therapy, but we expect a full recovery." Relief washed over Christian, but it was fleeting. While Scarlet's body would heal, he knew the psychological scars would linger. He thanked the surgeon briefly before entering the recovery room, where Scarlet lay pale but peaceful. Sitting beside her, he took her hand gently, silently vowing to fight for the justice she deserved. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Captain Richards faced an equally intense scene. Matthew sat in an interrogation room, his once confident demeanor shattered. The captain leaned against the table, his arms crossed. "You need to understand the gravity of what you've done," Richards said, his tone a mix of anger and disappointment. "This isn't going to be swept under the rug." Not this time. Matthew avoided his gaze, mumbling excuses about perceived threats and split-second decisions. Richards wasn't convinced. "That child's father is Judge Christian Carter. Do you have any idea who he is? You've unleashed a storm that will shake this department to its core." Matthew's face paled further. Realizing the magnitude of his actions, the media was already ablaze with the story. Footage of the incident spread like wildfire, accompanied by headlines condemning the officer's actions. Protesters gathered outside the hospital and police station, demanding accountability. Christian's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, civil rights groups, and colleagues. One call stood out: an old friend from law school, now a prominent civil rights attorney. "Christian," she said when he answered, "I saw the news. I'm so sorry. Whatever you need, I'm here." Christian's voice was firm as he replied, "I'll need all the help I can get. This isn't just about Scarlet. This is about making sure it never happens again." The sun had barely risen when Christian stood in his study, staring at the cluttered desk piled with legal documents and newspaper clippings about the incident. Scarlet's recovery, though promising, only fueled his resolve. He knew this was more than a personal tragedy. It was a battle for systemic change. The calls from civil rights groups and activists hadn't stopped, and Christian realized this fight was bigger than himself or Scarlet. It was a chance to challenge the biases and failures that allowed incidents like this to persist. Across town, Matthew Harris faced his own reckoning. His house had become a fortress, with blinds drawn and his phone turned off. Protesters chanted outside, their voices relentless and unyielding. The police union offered lukewarm support, but even they couldn't shield him from the growing backlash. Matthew replayed his actions in his mind, searching for justification, but the evidence was damning. His peers distanced themselves, whispering about his career being over. The weight of his choices bore down on him, leaving him isolated and fearful of what lay ahead. Christian, meanwhile, began assembling a formidable legal team. His law school friend, Angela Price, became the cornerstone of the effort, bringing with her years of experience in civil rights litigation. Together, they mapped out a strategy, not just to hold Matthew accountable, but to expose the systemic failures that led to the shooting. "This isn't just about one officer," Angela emphasized during a late-night meeting. "It's about a culture that allows people like him to act with impunity. We need to make this about the bigger picture." Christian nodded, his eyes hard with determination. "Then we make the bigger picture impossible to ignore," he replied. The first major step came with a press conference held on the hospital steps. Christian stood at the podium, his commanding presence amplified by the weight of his words. Behind him, Angela and other activists flanked him, creating a united front. Cameras flashed as Christian began to speak. "My daughter, Scarlet, was the victim of an unconscionable act of violence. She is just 8 years old, and yet she was seen as a threat because of the color of her skin. This is not just my fight. It is a fight for every parent who fears for their child's safety, for every community that has suffered under the weight of injustice. We demand accountability, not just for the officer who pulled the trigger, but for the system that empowered him to do so." His voice rang out, igniting a wave of applause and chants from the crowd. The fight had officially begun. E-press conference sent shockwaves across the nation. News outlets picked up Christian's speech, and his words became a rallying cry for change. Social media buzzed with hashtags demanding justice for Scarlet, while videos of the shooting and Christian's call to action spread like wildfire. Public pressure mounted, forcing the police department to issue a statement. Their response was vague, citing an ongoing investigation, but it did little to quell the outrage. The public wanted action, not excuses, and Christian's determination only grew with each passing hour. Angela worked tirelessly alongside Christian, digging into Matthew Harris's history. What they found was damning: a pattern of complaints filed by citizens alleging racial bias and excessive force. None had resulted in disciplinary action, each dismissed with flimsy justifications. "This is the foundation of our case," Angela said during a late-night strategy session. "We show that this wasn't an isolated incident. Matthew Harris is a symptom of a much larger problem." Christian nodded, his jaw tightening. "And we hold them accountable for every failure that led to this moment." Amid the turmoil, unexpected allies began to emerge. One was Detective Monica Ramirez, a veteran officer in the same precinct as Matthew. Monica had grown disillusioned with the department's culture of silence and complicity. She reached out to Christian through a mutual connection, offering inside knowledge. "I've seen too many cases like this swept under the rug," she said during their clandestine meeting. "It's time someone stood up. I want to help." Christian regarded her cautiously, but saw the sincerity in her eyes. With her insights, they gained a clearer picture of the systemic issues at play. Meanwhile, Matthew Harris found himself increasingly isolated. His attempts to justify his actions fell on deaf ears, even among his colleagues. Captain Richards, under intense scrutiny, made it clear that Matthew was on his own. "This department won't go down with you," Richards said coldly during a private meeting. Matthew's frustration boiled over. "I made a split-second decision. That's what we're trained to do," he argued. But Richards cut him off. "What you did wasn't training. It was prejudice. And now, we all pay the price." Matthew was left to confront the harsh reality. The system he had relied on to protect him was beginning to unravel. The protests outside the police precinct grew larger by the day. People from all walks of life joined the movement, carrying signs that read, "Justice for Scarlet" and "End Systemic Racism." What started as a local outcry had transformed into a national movement, placing the police department and city officials under a glaring spotlight. Christian continued to speak out, his presence on talk shows and news panels amplifying the urgency of the case. Each appearance revealed his eloquence and unwavering resolve, making him not just a grieving father, but a symbol of resistance against injustice. Inside the precinct, tensions reached a boiling point. Officers were divided, with some silently supporting Matthew while others distanced themselves entirely. Detective Monica Ramirez found herself on the receiving end of suspicion and hostility from colleagues who suspected her alliance with Christian's team. "You're either with us or against us," one officer snarled. But Monica remained unfazed. She had long grown tired of the unspoken rules that kept officers like Matthew protected. For her, this case wasn't just about Scarlet. It was a chance to break the toxic cycle that had poisoned the department for years. Angela and Christian, meanwhile, prepared for their first major legal strike, filing a civil lawsuit against Matthew Harris and the police department for negligence and violation of Scarlet's civil rights. The filing was accompanied by a scathing press release outlining the department's failure to address Matthew's history of complaints. "This is just the beginning," Angela said during their meeting. "We're going to shine a light on every corner they tried to keep in the dark." Christian nodded, though the weight of the fight was beginning to show. He missed the simplicity of his weekend mornings with Scarlet, free from the media frenzy and the constant reminders of her pain. Matthew, now cornered on all sides, struggled to maintain his composure. His wife had taken their children to stay with relatives, fearing the backlash would spill over into their lives. The protesters outside his home refused to relent, their chants a constant reminder of the life he had shattered. One evening, he received an anonymous envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a copy of one of the complaints filed against him years ago, dismissed without investigation. Scrawled across it were the words, "You're not the victim." For the first time, Matthew began to realize that his actions had consequences far beyond his own understanding. Christian sat by Scarlet's bedside, holding her hand as she rested. The hospital room, though quiet, felt heavy with the weight of their shared ordeal. Her once bright demeanor had dimmed, replaced by a guarded silence. She flinched at loud noises and avoided eye contact with the nurses. Watching his daughter's spirit waver filled Christian with a guilt he couldn't shake. though he knew the blame lay elsewhere. He leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're so brave, Scarlet," he whispered. "And I promise, Daddy won't stop until everything is made right." Meanwhile, Angela worked relentlessly to prepare their legal case. The media exposure had brought a flood of support, including witnesses who had seen Matthew's actions firsthand. Among them was a parkgoer who had recorded the entire incident. The video, though already circulated online, became a cornerstone of their evidence. "This footage shows more than just the act," Angela explained during a strategy session. "It captures the indifference, the lack of urgency to help. That's going to resonate with a jury." Christian nodded, though his focus was split between the case and Scarlet's recovery. "It's not just about winning," he replied. "It's about making them understand the pain they've caused." Matthew's life continued to unravel. His legal team, provided by the police union, urged him to remain silent and avoid further public scrutiny. But the pressure was unbearable. Protesters surrounded his house day and night, and even his closest allies within the department began to distance themselves. One evening, as he stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he barely recognized the man looking back. He saw not a protector of the community, but someone consumed by his own prejudices. For the first time, he began to question everything he believed about his role as an officer. Detective Monica Ramirez, undeterred by the hostility from her colleagues, continued to aid Christian's team. She provided internal memos and records that revealed a pattern of covering up misconduct within the department. "This isn't just about Harris," she said during a meeting with Angela and Christian. "It's a culture that lets officers like him thrive without accountability." Her revelations were the final piece of the puzzle, solidifying their argument that systemic failures had led to Scarlet's trauma. Christian felt a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. They weren't just fighting one man. They were dismantling the entire system that had protected him. The courtroom was packed to capacity as the first hearing began, the tension palpable. Christian sat in the front row with Angela by his side, his face a mask of resolve. Behind him, supporters filled the benches, their presence a powerful statement of solidarity. Across the room, Matthew Harris sat at the defendant's table, his posture rigid and his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him. The weight of his actions had finally brought him here, not as an officer of the law, but as a man facing judgment for his choices. Angela opened the proceedings with a fiery statement, meticulously outlining the department's systemic failures. "This case is not just about Scarlet Carter," she declared, her voice steady and unwavering. "It's about a pattern of negligence that allowed Officer Harris to remain on the force despite repeated warnings. The system enabled his prejudice, and that system must be held accountable." The gallery erupted in murmurs of agreement, but the judge swiftly called for order. Christian watched as Angela expertly laid out their case, her words cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. Matthew's defense team attempted to paint a different picture, emphasizing the split-second nature of his decision and the inherent risks of policing. They argued that Matthew had acted out of a sense of duty, not malice. But their narrative began to crumble as Angela introduced evidence of Matthew's disciplinary record, bolstered by Monica Ramirez's testimony. Monica's presence on the stand was a turning point. As she detailed the internal culture of silence and complicity, the courtroom hung on her every word. "I came forward because I believe in justice," she concluded, her voice trembling with emotion. "And justice means acknowledging the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." Outside the courtroom, the protests reached a fever pitch. News crews captured the growing movement, which now extended far beyond the city. People carried signs that read, "Justice for Scarlet," and "Reform Now," their chants echoing across the streets. Christian stood on the courthouse steps after the hearing, addressing the crowd. "This fight is not over," he said, his voice carrying above the noise. "But today we took a step forward. Together, we can ensure that no other child suffers like Scarlet did. Justice is not a request. It's a demand." His words ignited a thunderous cheer, and for the first time in weeks, Christian felt the tide began to turn in their favor. The days leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of preparation and reflection. Christian, Angela, and their team worked tirelessly, poring over every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every argument they planned to present. The stakes were higher than ever, not just for Scarlet, but for the countless others who had been silenced by a system that protected its own at the expense of justice. Christian often visited Scarlet in the evenings, sharing stories and reminding her of the progress they were making. Her strength became his anchor, a constant reminder of why he couldn't afford to falter. Angela's confidence in their case was growing, but she knew the trial would be grueling. Matthew's defense team had shifted tactics, leaning heavily on expert witnesses to argue that his actions were in line with police protocol. "They're going to play the fear card," Angela warned during one late-night meeting. "They'll argue that Harris acted out of caution, not malice. We need to dismantle that narrative before it takes root." Christian listened intently, his mind racing with strategies. "We'll show that caution doesn't mean bias," he said firmly, "and that fear doesn't excuse negligence." Detective Monica Ramirez continued to be a valuable ally, providing insight into the unspoken rules that governed the department. Her testimony had already shaken the courtroom, and she was preparing for a second round on the stand. "They'll try to discredit me," she said during a strategy session, "but I've got years of reports and first-hand accounts to back me up. They won't scare me into silence." Christian placed a hand on her shoulder, his gratitude evident. "You've already done more than we could have asked for, Monica. Your courage is going to change lives." As the trial date approached, public support reached a crescendo. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse day and night, their chants a constant reminder of the fight's significance. News outlets covered the story relentlessly, turning Christian into a national figure. Despite the pressure, he remained focused. On the eve of the trial, he stood in his study, looking at a photograph of Scarlet from happier times. Her radiant smile seemed to reassure him. "Tomorrow we will take this all the way," he murmured to himself. The final battle for justice was about to begin, and he was ready. The courtroom was filled with a charged silence as the trial began. Journalists packed the gallery, their cameras capturing every moment, while protesters gathered outside, their chants audible even through the thick walls. Christian sat beside Angela at the plaintiff's table, his demeanor calm but his resolve unwavering. On the other side, Matthew Harris avoided eye contact, his once stiff posture now slumped under the weight of public scrutiny. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, a reckoning that had been long overdue. Angela delivered her opening argument with precision and passion, painting a vivid picture of Scarlet's suffering and the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. "This is not just a case of one bad decision," she declared. "It is the product of years of neglect, bias, and a refusal to hold those in power accountable." The jury listened intently, their expressions grim. Christian watched as Angela brought the courtroom to life with her words, her voice unwavering as she presented the heart of their case. This wasn't just about justice for Scarlet. It was about changing the system. Matthew's defense team countered with their own narrative, arguing that his actions were driven by instinct and protocol. They brought in a former police trainer who testified about the split-second decisions officers must make in high-stress situations. But Angela dismantled their argument during cross-examination, pointing out the patterns of bias evident in Matthew's record. "Would you say that a split-second decision excuses years of unchecked prejudice?" she asked pointedly, forcing the witness to hesitate before answering. It was a critical moment, one that left the jury visibly unsettled. The climax came when Christian took the stand. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried the weight of a grieving father and a seasoned judge. "My daughter Scarlet is not a statistic. She is not a casualty of a broken system," he said, his tone both firm and emotional. "She is an 8-year-old girl who was robbed of her innocence because someone chose to see her as a threat instead of a child. I have spent my career fighting for justice, but this is personal, and it is a fight I will not abandon." His words struck a chord, leaving not just the jury but the entire courtroom visibly moved. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in after hours of deliberation. Christian sat with his hands clasped tightly, his heart pounding as he watched their faces. Scarlet's face flashed in his mind, her strength and innocence reminding him why this moment mattered so much. The judge called for order, and the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. We find the defendant, Officer Matthew Harris, guilty of gross negligence and the violation of Scarlet Carter's civil rights. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of relief and quiet applause from the gallery. Christian's eyes closed for a brief moment, a surge of emotion washing over him. Angela squeezed his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental victory. This wasn't just a win for Scarlet. It was a victory for every family that had suffered under similar circumstances. As the verdict was read in full, Matthew sat motionless, his face pale and his once defiant posture now broken. He looked toward Christian, as if searching for some semblance of forgiveness, but Christian's gaze remained resolute. There was no room for reconciliation here, only accountability. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Protesters cheered, their signs raised high as news of the verdict spread. Christian stepped onto the courthouse steps, greeted by the sea of supporters who had stood by him throughout the ordeal. Cameras flashed as he addressed the crowd. "Today, justice was served," he began, his voice strong but tinged with emotion. "But this is just the beginning. The work doesn't end here. We must continue to demand accountability, to dismantle systems of bias, and to create a world where every child can grow up free from fear." The crowd erupted into applause, chanting Scarlet's name as a symbol of hope and resilience. In the weeks that followed, Scarlet's recovery continued, both physically and emotionally. Though the road ahead was long, the love and support from her family and community gave her the strength to heal. Christian returned to his role as a judge, but his perspective had forever shifted. He became a leading advocate for systemic reform, using his platform to push for change. Matthew Harris, now stripped of his badge and facing a prison sentence, became a cautionary tale of the consequences of unchecked prejudice. As Christian sat on the porch one evening, watching Scarlet play in the yard, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. She laughed as her kite soared into the sky, its bright yellow tail dancing in the breeze. It was a small but powerful reminder of what they had fought for, a future where her joy could soar as freely as that kite. Thank you all for watching until now. If you made it here, comment justice and see you next time. Hugs.